Good morning. Ed Walker is our program manager at NSF. He'll be here later today. He got delayed on the way in, so I'm going to do a little bit of motivation and then talk about the study that we just released a couple weeks ago. So this is a study on best practices for partnerships between HPC centers, not just NSF centers, but worldwide centers that are multi-use HPC centers. And industrial users, and we'll try to draw some best practices out of the study that was performed by Hyperion. So we'll go through that introduction and get to the best practices quickly. But this was motivated in part by the National Strategic Computing Initiative. If you look at the 5 goals of that initiative, or 5 objectives, one is large-scale computing at the extreme scale, but there are 4 others, one of which is to enhance the ability to do public-private partnerships, not just in terms of NRE funding, like was Bob talked about earlier, to vendors, but also in terms of how industrial and private firms are able to use the technology that's provided. So we're focusing on the use of the technology, not what people need to fund their development directly. I'll also point out the NSF has a mission to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, as well as security. So these also fold into not just the academic basic science, but also helping motivate NSF to want to understand how these partnerships work and what are the best practices for them. A set of charts, or a chart that shows where NSF major resources are in terms of high-performance computing, and they support a number of different systems throughout the United States for open research and even proprietary research in some cases. So we'll talk about that. So our survey had goals to conduct in-depth surveys of a number of leading HPC centers and also their partnerships. Overall, there were 61 surveys done. They were extensive surveys that Hyperion carried out for us. About 31 for industrial partners, 30 for 35, I think, for centers, so 66 total. We wanted to produce a qualitative and quantitative study, research report, to be a reference guide for what the effective practices are. I'll go into that, and to, in some way, evaluate those practices, especially those that have implications for how these types of relationships can be developed. So there were extensive interviews. Bob and Earl and others did. They averaged about 2 to 3 hours each after a survey was provided by the partners or by the people that volunteered to work with us. I don't know who they are. They're anonymous, so we appreciate everybody's work there. So some of the key trends that have come out of the overall survey, and I did show the URL at the first page. The survey was published and is available to download and read. But some of the key trends are and it's a theme that's synergistic with what you've heard earlier this morning. Stakeholders and political leaders are viewing HPC benefits for economic competitiveness in new ways and as important. Many government organizations are pushing to develop domestic suppliers and to use HPC as one of the ways of doing that. Science, open science, if you will, or basic research, will remain the primary focus of academic and open science centers. And when I say open science centers, I'm talking about things in national laboratories, research centers, government-sponsored, as well as others. But more and more, the publicly funded HPC centers are expanding access to industrial users in a variety of different ways. And are growing in their expertise of how to support these partnerships. And the HPC centers are trying to market their expertise as well as their resources to attract industrial users is an increasing activity. The study identified 4 types of centers. First one does only science and has no industrial participation or doesn't anticipate any industrial participation. That was a relatively small number. Open science only, but has industrial team members on their science team. So if they're doing just peer review science or some type of peer review allocation process, often there are industrial members of those teams, but there's not an explicit industrial type of allocation. And then there are open science and open industrial research. That means that the industrial research or activities are publishable or shareable in some extent, so that it's still an open process. And then fourth, there are open science with open industrial research with also proprietary research. So centers that have the ability to provide their resources and their expertise in all three of those areas. What are the benefits? We'll show some graphics in a little bit, but what are the benefits? The primary benefits that industry viewed was increased competitiveness, new discoveries and insights that they find, and faster product development. However, the centers also view benefits for this. One is unexpected new pathways for science and the things that they're interested in, increased motivation and retention of their computational and scientific staffs because they're being presented with new challenging problems, and revenue for reinvestment in the center for those that actually have some type of charging mechanism or reimbursement mechanism. You can look here at the demographics of where the centers were located and where the industrial organizations that were interviewed are located. 35 centers, 31 industrial partners. These were partners that had a significant participation in using HPC centers. 97% of the centers that were investigated actually received some type of public funding, national funding from either the EU or the nation, or in the United States, National Science Foundation or Department of Energy or NASA or something like that. And it's split pretty evenly around most of the world, pretty evenly between energy and manufacturing and biosciences, with some financial services in terms of the disciplines of the industrial work. And the sizes of the companies range from 10 million to over well over $1 billion in terms of the sizes of the institutions using this. So the important reasons for the important benefits by responders, and here we're showing a set of bar graphs. The darker blue are what the center responses were. These are interviews with a variety of staff at the centers, typically the center directors or senior personnel, as well as some others. And then what the industrial partners have to say in terms of what they think the benefits are. So they are different views between what the industrial organizations and the centers view as benefits, but they all believe that there are strong benefits. You can see competitiveness being different than, say, discovery and insight, but there are enough benefits to both sides to make these types of relationships well worthwhile. A little bit different is the satisfaction with the partnerships. So the survey asked, how satisfied are you with the partnerships you have been in, and why so? And 10 is the highest. If you're 6 and above, then you were showing some reasonable degree of satisfaction with the partnerships that you've experienced. And you can see that there's a lot of these that are 10, 9, 8, and 7. They do vary a little bit by what the center feels and what the industrial partner feels, but overall, almost all the participants in these partnerships were extremely well satisfied. So many of the programs that exist right now are doing very well in satisfying both parties of those partnerships. Comparing to expectations, what the organizations or the centers had going in versus how they turned out, there's actually a pretty close matching that the large majority of centers and partners indicate the expectations were met or exceeded. And only a few that said there was some problem with that. So again, high degree of satisfaction, but there was also a correlation between what they thought would happen and what actually happened in some manner with that. Here's a list of the benefits, and I know this is a little smaller font, but the report is there in terms of what the expectations are. Access to technology, you see, is a high one. New technology. Access to expertise is second. And one of the themes that you'll see throughout the study is the expertise in the centers is highly valued by the industrial partners. It's not just they want cycles. They can buy those from Google or Amazon. It's actually the expertise that maybe is the most most important part, certainly a very big part, and then access to advanced technology that they may not be able to easily get within their corporate structure at the time. So again, a lot of consistency in agreement on benefits, although the centers typically are, in this case, citing a little bit higher benefit rating than the industrial partners, but not significantly. The overall value is dominated by both parties seeing that this is a very valuable partnership, and very valuable is certainly by far more than 80% of the organizations listed this as being highly valuable. So before we get into a little more of the specifics, I thought I'd point out two kind of meta best practices, right? So we're going to talk about some of the best practices, but the kind of big messages across a multiple set of these best practices are, first off, bilateral communication at all levels in multiple ways and in a very proactive way is critical to the success of meeting or exceeding expectations. So you'll see the actual direct best practices, but a lot has to do with communications before starting, after starting, moving forward to succeeding through the process. The other is that I mentioned this already, the industrial organizations want the expertise that exists. They just don't want cycles. They can get those elsewhere. They want actually to engage with the expertise, and there'll be best practices that are suggested in the findings that centers should pay attention to. Most of the way the report words the findings, it is advice to the centers in terms of what they should be doing. I think, however, we have to keep in mind that there's an equal balance between advice to the industrial organizations that are entering into these partnerships as well. This is all a two-way street, and not one party has to do all the work. But the way the study is together, it's advice to the centers most of the time in terms of what they should do in terms of best practices. So if a center or a resource provider, an expertise provider, does want to engage with industry and partnerships, they need to take that focus seriously and make a sustained effort at doing a very good job at it. So the first thing is to signal to both the potential industry users, but also the staff in these centers that these types of partnerships are important and strategic to the organization by doing things like putting this explicitly in mission statements and making it an explicit part of your organization, and not just doing it as a one-off because you may want to get somebody to pay a little bit for time. So the successful messages take this very seriously. Public funding organizations should also actively encourage in the expansion of partnerships, and we saw examples of that throughout the morning, but now we have, through the study, some more concrete information about that. The study is also has many quotations spread throughout it from people, and those quotations are identified by what type of organization are they? Are they European? Are they U.S.? Are they large scale, small, medium scale types of organizations, so you can track actually the input that the survey received in qualitative ways. There should be the ability or the effort to take the requirements of industrial users into account when selecting or bidding on systems. So take the use that you see from the industrial point of view, which may be different than the basic science point of view, and take that into account as you're starting to select your architectures and or your services. An important other best practice is to focus on the domains and the expertise. This goes back to the expertise. Focus on the domains that the center knows well. Don't try to do things that are things that you don't have expertise, things that you don't have experience in doing. You can grow in your domains, your expertise over time, but if you want to have successful partnerships, focus on the things you do well. I think the example in the report is, well, not every center can do transportation or automotive type applications well. The ones probably near automotive or have relationships with automotive industry or near automotive manufacturing regions probably can do that better than others in terms of universities or research centers. So make sure that you have the things that are needed to make successful relationships work. Another is to hire some people with business expertise to lead the partnership programs with industry. It is a cultural issue, a communication issue, that there are different expectations between industrial organizations and more general purpose research centers in terms of how they do business, how they communicate. So having people who can have a foot in both those worlds, but in particular knowing how businesses work, knowing what their pressures and pain points are, is an important area for being successful. In some ways, transferring an academic to do this may not be the best or most effective choice, so that's another best practice. Another one is to have actually experienced people work with the industrial partners. In many cases, the industrial partners will be the people who are putting their best people on something like this. And they want to have the best people at the centers on this and not have junior staff. That was kind of a theme through some of the comments. So what is really desired is to foster peer-to-peer partnerships and relationships through these, where there's mutual respect on both sides for the skill, the expertise, and the dedication of the staff on both sides to solve these challenging challenges for industry. And another best practice is to keep the staff at the centers assigned to the projects throughout the life of the project. And the lives of the projects range from a few days to a few years in terms of that. But have consistency of people, and don't have a new person every time somebody calls up and says they have a need on the industrial side. Providing opportunities for both open and proprietary research is important. There are some firms that are able to do open research and publish their research. Those are typically the larger firms, the ones that have dedicated research departments in them, where they're able to do some degree of open research as well as the proprietary research that's needed for their intellectual property. So for centers that can provide both types of opportunities, there is a lot of important work that needs to be done. In most cases, governance frameworks make this a little challenging in terms of what is allowed, and there's multiple levels of that all the way through, World Trade Organization requirements in terms of what is allowed to be done in a proprietary manner on a publicly funded center. But in most cases, the centers have figured out ways to do this appropriately within the governance that they're working towards or under. There's a good number of publishable or shareable industrial projects that exist around the center, so there's ways of doing all three of those or types of things that I mentioned in terms of centers to support industrial activity. Some of the centers do offer a third category or somewhere in between those four categories of research, and that's specifically an agreement where some of the results are open enough to make it valuable for open research and be able to compete for allocations in that mode, but a few pieces of that are kept proprietary. So, for example, it may be pre-competitive, but there's a lead time before those results come out, so that there's a way to have some advantage for that for the company carrying out the effort, because a lot of times the company carrying out the effort is funding their people and the center is funding its people and the resources. So there are ways to adjust based on the governance models from your funding organizations that you have to think about and be creative about. But in all cases, both types of the completely open research, the proprietary or the mixed, have benefits for the centers and the industrial partners from the survey. Addressing cultural gaps with consistent communication and in a timely manner. There certainly are different expectations going into that, and some of you all understand that as you work through working on one side or the other of the, or in the middle for these partnerships. Typically, businesses expect to operate on a quicker time schedule than open academic research, and they have deadlines that are important to them, maybe for product development. If they miss, they're not going to be able to have that in the product. So the centers have to pay attention to this and help make the resources and the expertise available when it's needed on time delivery. Hiring people with the experience helps with that communication, but also setting clear expectations at the start of a relationship is also important, because there are some things that may or may not be able to be matched with what the expectations are. And if you leave them as implicit expectations, like I thought this was going to happen, it leads to challenges later on when they're not met, or there's a misinterpretation, different interpretation on both sides. So you'll see on this chart, amongst other things, a set of suggestions about how you start a relationship or a partnership. Most of the centers that were surveyed insisted that just because they exist doesn't mean that they get a lot of industrial partners coming to them. Having to advertise and market their skills and expertise and their resources is a constant issue for getting partners to work with them. Focusing on a small number of domains to make sure you're successful, and then expanding that if you can. Setting the expectation clearly. And then the next is how maybe are some best practices or suggestions of doing that in the small bullet points of what each party should do, the time needed, the types of expertise, the milestones for the project. How do you know it's making successful progress? How are you going to advertise this to your stakeholders and to outside that this is going on? So for many of the centers, it's very important that that type of success is also shared to their stakeholders, even if it's not openly available. So somehow the stakeholders who are funding this know that there is good stuff going on, even in a proprietary partnership. So all those suggestions are good practices to follow. A lot of the issues are about IP and contracts, so streamlining that amongst the organizations is a very good first step. Having an umbrella organization so sub-projects can be created underneath that was one of the suggestions for best practices, and making sure that it's about a collaboration, not just with the users of HPC resources. There are many opportunities that were pointed out in the survey for the best practices of promoting a vital transfer of technology and knowledge from industry to the centers and back. Publicly supporting HPC centers provide access to industry users, and the relationships are opening up new pathways for products and services in those industries, but also for what the academic centers do. And for public funders, there is a number of documented areas where the return on investment economically is quite substantial. You saw some of those earlier today. Some of the challenges, though: bridging that gap of expectations, getting access for the centers to getting recognition for the centers to treat these partnerships as very important, and the same for helping navigate those governance issues by the funding centers. So a couple of statistics in the last couple minutes we have here. The average length of partnerships that centers were creating, not just an individual partnership, but partnership programs, is about 15 years. Some actually, like NCSA, go back 31 years, the entire existence of NCSA. A number of participating businesses over that time period from the centers was about 90, above 90 in terms of who those partnerships were with. The average number that are participating today is about 24, and the average duration is about 3.5 years of the partnerships, with the longest one being close to 10. The profiles of governance framework for about half, or 2/3 of the respondents on both sides. This is combining centers and industry. They were satisfied with how governance works. About 1/3 was not, and it has to do with regulations, where they came from, where the oversight's coming from. Over almost 70% have a reimbursement program, so the industry partnerships in part have reimbursed for their time and their services. About 31% don't have a reimbursement program, so those are all kind of on the open side. Access to on-demand for industrial users. About a quarter of the centers provide some type of enhanced access on demand whenever you want it. You go to the head of the queue. But most of the work is done more or less in the general priority schemes of that. How many centers provide technical support? And this is above just, I set up a contract and leave you alone. 97% of the centers are providing technical services to their industrial partners, and that is a pretty remarkable number. Domain expertise as well as general support and computation. How many provide domain expertise? If you're doing fluids, I have domain experts in fluids or aeronautics or bio or oil and gas. 83% of the centers are providing domain expertise to their industrial partnerships. Again, a pretty high, surprising number to me at least. So finally, and it just hit 0, the publication is released and you can look at it in your leisure. We're trying to make these findings broadly known to the community and then see how we go from there. There's ideas about further steps to expand kind of more specialized studies or broader studies. This was only about multi-use HPC centers and the industrial partners that use them. We know that there exists in research centers and academic centers other types of industrial partnerships that are not just multi-use HPC centers. They may be dedicated to a certain type of technology or company. So things like that are possibilities for doing that. If you know anybody or want to host a discussion, we'd be happy to go through these or go through certain subsets of this with people that you think might be interested in it. This work was supported by NSF. And was carried out by Hyperion and NCSA. So first, I'd like to thank the people and organizations that put up with a 3 or 4 hour, or I guess 2 or 3 hour interview and the surveys. As I said, I don't know who they are. They're anonymous, but we thank you all. And if any of you participate in this room, thank you very much. Certainly the staff at Hyperion who conducted the surveys, that was the vast amount of the effort. Thank you very much for putting that together and putting multiple drafts of our report together and working with us at NCSA. Merle Giles was the initial PI on this and started the whole idea, so thank him. And then I got the privilege of helping at the end, so appreciate that. And then also our National Science Foundation funders, Irene Qualters and Ed Walker, who will be later here. So any questions if there's time?
Yeah, I have one, Bill. Is there any quantification of the dollar value for strictly purchase of HPC time?
I don't. So how many dollars are these centers receiving for purchasing HPC time? I don't believe that that's in the survey. There's a dollar value for either how much the industrial organizations spend or how much the centers receive. Some centers receive a significant amount, but if Bob or Steve...
no, we didn't specifically collect that number, but what we did determine is that almost all of them charge market rates for this, and almost nobody goes below market rates for fear of running into that, stepping into the marketplace and competing with commercial centers that offer HPC services.
And I think I remember you identified some of the centers are charging above market rates just to stay out of that issue of are they competing with other at cell time. Yep, back there. No. Yeah. So the question is, why did people disengage, even though it was a relatively well? So there's a cycle of projects, right? In some centers, I don't know of any center that stopped offering partnerships, but the partnerships may have turned over for corporate reasons, other types of things. The disengagements probably go around more of the projects, but I don't know if Steve wants to comment on that one. Because Steve did a lot of the interviews and put together the documents, so give him a mic. Paul.
Yeah, there are centers where the average engagement is 3 months. And by policy, they don't take on anyone that's going to take more than 6 months. That's particularly true. Earl and I have visited some of those in Asia that have that policy, and some of them take on hundreds of projects like that, but they have to be short-term projects. Other ones, it tends to be with the larger the company, the longer the engagement tends to be. For example, in some parts of DOE, there are relationships with commercial companies that are paid relationships that have gone on for a decade or more.
So just as a follow-up to that, so I mean, when you think about a business model that's based by geography, I mean, are those quick fix, do they see it as a business or more as a just?
In the case that sometimes it's, you know, as Bill said, in most cases there's payment, but there are some governments who, in order to make HPC use more pervasive, allow small and medium enterprises to do their first project absolutely free and have competitions, you know, for doing that.
And even large projects.
Yeah, and even some large projects. So they, yep.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the United States, land-grant colleges have an obligation to facilitate the economic good, and that goes a lot to corporations in their regions as well as agriculture and other things. So that's in part of the missions of land-grant colleges from the very beginning. So it's that type of mission orientation that is not just related to HPC, but related to other things that go on.